You ever pull into a gas station late at night, thinking you'll be in and out in 5 minutes? Yeah, that's what I thought too. Let me tell you what happened to me 2 years ago in a place I'll never forget. It was a late October night, pitch black sky, no moon, and the road stretching out before me like a long, empty void. I was driving back from a friend's wedding in northern Michigan, about halfway through an 8-hour trip home. Around 2 a.m., the fuel gauge dipped below the red line, and the nearest gas station was about 15 miles off the highway. The GPS said it was a 24-hour place, so I figured I'd be fine. When I pulled up, the station looked odd. It wasn't rundown exactly, but it had an old-fashioned feel, like it had been untouched since the 80s. The overhead lights flickered, casting jittery shadows across the cracked pavement. There were no other cars, and the convenience store's neon open sign buzzed faintly. I got out of my car and felt an icy breeze that made me pull my jacket tighter. The pump was one of those older ones without a screen, just a faded sticker saying, "Pay inside." Great, I was already creeped out, but I needed gas, so I headed into the store. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and the smell of mildew hit me like a wall. The aisles were cluttered with expired snacks and dusty trinkets, but no one was at the counter. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed faintly, but there was no answer. I leaned over the counter, craning my neck to see if anyone was in the back. That's when I noticed the old black and white security monitors stacked in the corner. They showed grainy footage of the gas station, but something wasn't right. In one of the screens, I saw myself standing at the counter. Only I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing behind me, a tall man in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't there when I turned around. The store was empty. I froze, staring at the monitor, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The man didn't move. He just stood there on the screen, his head tilted slightly as though he were staring at me. I turned around again, this time slower, scanning every inch of the store. Nothing. I thought maybe I was seeing things. I'd been driving for hours and I was exhausted. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler to settle my nerves. That's when I noticed something else on the monitors. In another screen, one showing the pump I was parked at, there was a car. A black sedan, sleek and shiny, like it had just rolled off the lot. It wasn't there when I pulled up. I was sure of it, but there it was now, parked right beside mine, and a man was standing next to it, staring directly into the camera. He had the same wide-brimmed hat and long coat as the figure from before. I bolted for the door, but as soon as I stepped outside, the lot was empty again. No black sedan, just my car, sitting under the flickering lights. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. I decided I'd just pay at the pump and get out of there. As I swiped my card and started pumping, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced around but didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling, like invisible eyes were boring into me from every direction. I filled the tank as fast as I could, jumped into the car, and slammed the door shut. I locked it out of instinct and turned the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. It just clicked. Come on, I muttered, turning the key again. Same result. I was stranded. Suddenly, there was a knock on the driver's side window. I nearly screamed. Standing there was a young woman in a tattered hoodie and ripped jeans, her face pale and gaunt. I hadn't seen her anywhere before, and I had no idea where she'd come from. "Hey, can you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My car broke down just up the road. I saw your lights and walked here." Something about her didn't sit right with me. Her eyes were wide and glassy, and she was shivering even though the night wasn't that cold. I glanced at the passenger seat, considering whether to let her in, but my gut screamed no. "I can call someone for you," I stammered. Her face twisted into a mix of desperation and anger. "Please, you don't understand. He's coming. He's been following me." "Who's following you?" I asked, but before she could answer, the lights in the gas station lot all went out at once. The darkness swallowed us, and the only light came from the faint glow of my dashboard. Then I saw him, the man in the wide-brimmed hat. He was standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the dim glow. The woman saw him too and let out a choked sob. "He found me," she whispered, backing away from my car. "Don't let him take me, please." I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows. Suddenly, the woman screamed. Her voice was piercing, full of sheer terror, and then she was gone. Just like that, she vanished into the night. The man in the hat turned his head toward me. Even though I couldn't see his face, I felt his gaze, cold and heavy. The car finally roared to life, and I floored it, tires screeching as I tore out of the lot. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a crowded truck stop and parked under the brightest lights I could find. I told myself it was over, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I got out of the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a smudge on the driver's side window, right where the woman had been standing. It wasn't a handprint or anything recognizable, just a smear, dark and oily, like something unnatural had touched it. I never went back to that gas station. I don't even drive that route anymore. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I still feel like I'm being watched. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the corner of my eye, wearing a wide-brimmed hat.
Story number 2.
It was the summer of 2016, and I was on a road trip from Arizona to Texas. The highway was endless, cutting through barren stretches of desert. Around midnight, my stomach grumbled, and my fuel gauge wasn't looking great either. My GPS flagged a gas station a few miles ahead, so I decided to stop. From the highway, it looked like a beacon, a glowing sign reading Tony's Gas and Food. The place sat alone, surrounded by nothing but sand and scrub. As I pulled in, my headlights swept over the empty lot. A single pickup truck was parked near the side of the building, but there wasn't a soul in sight. The station was old, with faded paint and cracked windows. A single streetlight flickered above the pumps, casting jittery shadows. I parked and stepped out of my car, the dry desert wind brushing against my skin. The pump was one of those relics that didn't accept cards, so I headed inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a rusty bell jingled overhead. The store was dimly lit with buzzing fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly green. Shelves were lined with dusty cans of soup, faded bags of chips, and off-brand sodas. At the counter, a man sat on a stool, his face hidden behind a newspaper. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond, didn't even look up. His hands were pale, bony, gripping the edges of the paper. Something about him felt off. "I need to pay for gas," I added, louder this time. Finally, he lowered the newspaper, and I swear I nearly stepped back. His face was waxy, almost plastic-looking, like a mannequin brought to life. His eyes didn't blink as he stared at me, and his lips barely moved when he said, "Pump 3." I nodded, suddenly eager to leave. As I turned, something caught my eye, a bulletin board near the door, cluttered with faded missing persons flyers. There were at least 20 of them, all tacked haphazardly, some so old the ink had faded. One flyer stood out. The face on it was a teenage boy, maybe 16, with shaggy hair and a toothy grin. His name was Caleb, and he'd been missing since 1989. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized something. The man at the counter, he looked exactly like Caleb, only older, with hollow eyes and that unnaturally waxy skin. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. I paid for the gas and hurried back to my car. As I pumped the gas, I kept glancing toward the store. The man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring out the window now, his unblinking eyes fixed on me. I finished fueling as quickly as I could and jumped back into the driver's seat. When I started the engine, my headlights illuminated something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the lot. It was a woman, dressed in a torn sundress, her hair wild and matted. She was barefoot and her arms hung limply at her sides. I rolled down my window just a crack. "Hey, do you need help?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me with wide, haunted eyes. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed toward the gas station. I turned to look at the store, and my blood ran cold. The man at the counter was gone. The stool where he'd been sitting was empty, and the lights inside the store were flickering violently. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone too. Panic set in. I threw the car into reverse, ready to get the hell out of there. But before I could move, something slammed against the back of my car. The whole vehicle rocked, and I screamed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but couldn't see anything. My hands were shaking as I reached for the gear shift. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping on my driver's side window. I turned my head slowly, and there he was, the man from the gas station. He was standing just outside my window, his face inches from the glass. His eyes were empty, black pits, and his mouth twisted into a grin far too wide for his face. "Don't leave yet," he whispered. His voice was distorted like a recording played backward. I screamed, slamming my foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched as I peeled out of the lot, the smell of burning rubber filling my nose. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, watching me drive away. I didn't stop driving until I reached a crowded truck stop miles down the highway. My hands were still shaking as I parked and tried to collect myself. When I looked at my car in the daylight the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Across the back window, written in the dust, were the words, "You'll be back." I've never taken that route again, and I never will. But sometimes late at night, I think about those missing persons flyers, about Caleb and the way the man at the counter looked exactly like him. And I wonder, what happens to the people who stop at Tony's Gas and Food and never leave?
Story number 3.
It happened last winter, during the worst blizzard I'd ever seen. I was on my way to visit my parents in rural Wyoming, a drive that normally took about 5 hours. But the storm slowed everything to a crawl. Whiteout conditions, icy roads, and zero visibility. It was a nightmare. By the time I spotted the faint glow of a gas station off the side of the road, I was running low on gas and patience. My fingers were numb from gripping the steering wheel, and my nerves were frayed. The sign above the station read, "Harper's Fuel and Groceries," and the place looked like it had been abandoned years ago. But the lights were on, so I pulled in, thankful for the reprieve. The lot was empty, and snow had piled up against the sides of the building. I parked near the pump and got out, the biting wind cutting through my jacket. As I approached the pump, I noticed something strange. The numbers on the meter weren't moving, even though the nozzle was hanging loosely from its hook. I tapped the screen, but nothing happened. That's when I saw the handwritten sign taped to the pump. "Pay inside." Great. I trudged through the snow toward the building, which looked even creepier up close. The windows were frosted over and icicles hung from the eaves like jagged teeth. When I opened the door, a little bell jingled, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the eerie quiet inside. The place was dimly lit with rows of dusty shelves and a single fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. An old man sat behind the counter, his back hunched and his face obscured by the brim of a battered cowboy hat. "Evening," I said, trying to sound normal. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, motionless. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were pale, almost translucent, with long, yellowed fingernails that curved like claws. I need to fill up," I said. The man finally moved, lifting his head to look at me. His eyes were a milky white like he was blind, but they seemed to pierce right through me. "Pump 2, he said in a raspy voice, then lowered his head again. I quickly handed over some cash and got out of there, my heart pounding. Something about the man made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was just my imagination. As I pumped the gas, the storm seemed to intensify. The wind howled and snow swirled around me, making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. Then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind kicking up the snow. But then I saw it again, a dark shape flitting between the pumps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I finished pumping as quickly as I could and got back in my car, locking the doors behind me. My breath fogged up the windows as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. That's when I saw it. A face pressed against the passenger side window. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I screamed, scrambling to get away, but when I looked back, the face was gone. I stared at the window, my heart racing, when a loud thud came from the roof of the car. Something heavy had landed on top of it. The car rocked as whatever it was moved, scraping across the metal with sharp claws. I fumbled with my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The roof creaked, and then a hand appeared at the edge of the windshield. It was gnarled and skeletal, with long, curling nails. I couldn't see its owner, but I could hear its labored breathing, rasping and wet. I threw open the door and bolted into the storm, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. The snow was blinding, and the cold seared my lungs as I ran. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old shed behind the gas station. The door was half buried in snow, but I forced it open and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The shed was small and cluttered, filled with rusty tools and broken furniture. I crouched in the corner, trying to catch my breath. My fingers were numb, and my teeth chattered violently. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, heading straight for the shed. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the door. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the doorknob began to turn. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was the old man from the gas station, but his face was different now. His skin hung loosely from his skull, and his milky eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Behind him, I saw shadows moving, shapes that didn't belong to anything human. They slithered and crawled, their forms shifting and flickering like flames. The last thing I remember was the old man reaching out for me, his icy fingers brushing against my face. Then, everything went black. I woke up hours later, slumped in my car. The storm had passed, and the gas station was gone. The lot was empty, covered in fresh snow with no sign that it had ever been there. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but sometimes when I drive through the snow, I feel like something's watching me. And every so often, I catch a glimpse of that old man in my rearview mirror.
Story number 4.
I was on my way back from a week-long camping trip in northern Idaho. The forest had been serene, but by the end of it, I was itching to get back to civilization. It was late, probably close to 1 a.m., and the road I was on was one of those lonely, winding highways where you don't see another car for miles. The low fuel warning light pinged on my dashboard, and I cursed under my breath. I'd passed a couple of gas stations earlier in the night, but of course, I hadn't stopped. My phone barely had a signal, but I managed to pull up a GPS marker for a nearby station. It was about 10 minutes off the highway, tucked into the middle of nowhere. When I pulled in, the gas station looked wrong. Not broken down or abandoned, but just off in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The building was small, with bright, unnatural lighting that made everything look sharper than it should. There were no cars in the lot, and the neon sign above the door simply said, "Gas," in flickering red letters. I parked at the nearest pump and rolled down my window, only to see a handwritten sign taped to it. "Prepay inside." Grumbling, I got out of the car. The air was still, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of stillness that made you feel like you were being watched. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a faint bell jingled. The inside of the station was clean, almost too clean, like a showroom. The shelves were fully stocked, but all the labels looked off, like they were slightly blurred or written in a language I didn't recognize. Behind the counter was a woman, her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She smiled as I walked in, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just gas," I said, sliding a 20 onto the counter. Her smile widened unnaturally. "Sure thing, pump 4. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the store was a rack of Polaroid photos, each one showing a different person standing in front of the gas station. Some of the photos were yellowed and curling at the edges, while others looked brand new. Curiosity got the better of me. "What's with the pictures?" The woman's smile didn't falter. "Regulars," she said, her tone too cheerful. "We like to remember our visitors." I nodded, uneasy, and walked back outside. As I pumped the gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The pumps, the lot, the entire place was empty. That's when I saw it. Across the street, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long to be human. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me. My heart pounded as I yanked the nozzle out of the tank and jumped back into my car. I locked the doors and glanced back toward the figure, but it was gone. As I pulled out of the station, my headlights swept across the lot, illuminating the windows of the store. The woman was still standing behind the counter, but she wasn't alone. The tall figure was now inside, standing right behind her. I floored it, speeding back toward the highway. The road was dark, and the trees on either side seemed to close in around me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me. About 20 minutes later, I saw another gas station up ahead. It looked normal. Bright lights, cars parked out front, people moving around inside. I pulled in, desperate to calm my nerves. As I stepped out of the car, a man in a flannel jacket approached me. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice concerned. "Yeah," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "Just came from that station down the road." The man's expression darkened. "What station?" "The one about 15 miles back," I said. He shook his head. "There's no station out there. Hasn't been for years. It burned down back in the 90s. A lot of folks went missing there before they finally shut it down." I froze, my blood running cold. Later that night, when I checked my car, I noticed something on the rear bumper. It was a handprint, long and thin, burned into the metal like it had been seared there. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that if you're ever driving down a lonely highway and come across a gas station that doesn't quite feel right, don't stop. Just keep driving.
Story number 5.
It was fall, and I was driving through rural Kentucky after a late-night visit with an old college friend. The 2-lane road cut through dense woods, and the only light came from my headlights and the occasional glimpse of the moon through the clouds. Around midnight, my gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier and was relieved when a dimly lit sign came into view: Granger's Gas, open 24/7. The station was tucked just off the road, surrounded by towering trees. It looked like something from another time, with peeling paint on the walls and an old mechanical pump that didn't even have a card reader. I pulled in and parked under a single flickering light. The lot was empty, and the place had an eerie stillness to it, like the world had stopped moving. A bell jingled faintly as I pushed open the door to the small convenience store. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and mildew. A man stood behind the counter, tall and wiry, with a face that seemed carved out of stone. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, like they could cut through me. "Just gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Finally, he grunted and rang up the total. As I handed him cash, I noticed a small corkboard behind the counter. It was covered with faded photos of people, families, couples, kids, all smiling in front of this very gas station. A chill ran down my spine when I realized some of the photos looked decades old. "Nice decor," I said, nodding toward the board. The man didn't smile. "Memories," he said flatly. I nodded awkwardly and headed back to the pump, eager to leave. As I filled the tank, I felt an uncomfortable sensation, like I was being watched. I glanced toward the woods and saw something move, a shadow, too quick and fluid to be an animal. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination, and returned my focus to the pump. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across metal. I spun around, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, echoing around the lot, and I realized it was coming from my car. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I crouched to check under the car, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw them. Handprints. Smudged and greasy, they covered the sides of my car like someone, or something, had been circling it. Panicking, I yanked the nozzle out of the tank and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors, turned the key, and slammed on the gas. As I sped out of the lot, my headlights caught movement in the rearview mirror. Something tall and impossibly thin darted out from behind the gas station, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it chased after me. I floored it, the engine roaring as the creature gained on me. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Just as it was about to reach the car, the gas station disappeared. Not just from my mirror. It was gone, like it had never existed. The road ahead was empty, the trees looming on either side. My heart raced as I drove, refusing to look back again. When I reached the nearest town, I pulled into a diner, shaking and pale. The waitress gave me a concerned look as I stumbled inside. "You okay, honey?" she asked. I nodded, still catching my breath. "Just came from Granger's Gas up the road," I said. Her face went white. "Granger's? That place burned down back in '85. People said it was cursed. Folks would go missing, and when the fire took it, they found bones in the rubble. Lots of bones." I stared at her, unable to speak. That was the last time I drove that road, and I haven't taken another midnight trip since. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my car, I swear I can still hear that scratching sound.
Story number 6.
I work as a delivery driver, and one night I was driving through the desolate backroads of Texas on a route I wasn't familiar with. It was pitch black, and my GPS had led me down a narrow, cracked road surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. The needle on my fuel gauge was dangerously low, and I hadn't seen another car or sign of life in miles. Just as I started to panic, my headlights caught a small, weathered sign on the side of the road. "Last stop gas, open all night." Relieved, I turned onto a gravel driveway that led to a small, isolated gas station. The place looked ancient, more like a relic from the 1950s than something still in operation. The building was a squat wooden structure with peeling white paint, and the gas pumps were old school, the kind with spinning numbers. I got out of the car, the cold air prickling my skin, and tried to use the pump, but it didn't seem to work. A faded sign taped to it read, "Pay inside first." I walked toward the store, glancing at the fields around me. The grass swayed gently, but there was no wind. That should have tipped me off, but I was too focused on getting gas to care. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and a bell chimed faintly. The inside was dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights and shelves stocked with dusty, outdated products. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of something metallic and unpleasant. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as old as the station itself. He was hunched over, his skin sallow and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were pale and glassy, but they followed me as I entered. "Need gas," I said, placing a 20 on the counter. The man didn't speak at first, just stared at me with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and malice. Finally, he nodded and pushed the money into an ancient cash register. "Pump one," he said in a gravelly voice. I was about to leave when I noticed a corkboard on the wall beside the counter. It was covered in Polaroid photos, each one showing a person standing in front of the gas station. Some were smiling, some weren't. What made my stomach drop was that every photo had a date written on it, and all the dates were from decades ago, except for one. The most recent photo was dated the same day. It showed me standing by my car. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. "What is this?" The man's lips curled into a crooked grin. "Memories," he said. I bolted out of the store, my heart pounding. When I got to my car, the tank was full, even though I hadn't touched the pump. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without looking back. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the gas station disappear. Instead, I saw something else. A figure sitting in my back seat. It was the man from the gas station, his pale eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. When I turned around, the back seat was empty. Shaking, I pressed the accelerator and kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. A few minutes later, I passed another car heading in the opposite direction. I flashed my lights to warn them, but they didn't stop. As they passed, I glanced in my mirror and saw their brake lights illuminate as they pulled into the gas station I had just fled. I never told anyone what happened that night. I don't even know if they'd believe me, but I don't take back roads anymore, and I never let my gas tank get too low.
Story number 7.
I was heading home from a weekend trip to the mountains, driving through a stretch of lonely desert road late at night. The horizon was endless black, broken only by the occasional tumbleweed skittering across the highway. I'd been driving for hours, and my gas gauge was dangerously close to empty. Just when I thought I might have to pull over and sleep in my car, I spotted a glowing sign in the distance, Riley's Gas and Goods 24/7. The station was small and unassuming, nestled at the edge of the desert. The pumps were rusted and old, and a single flickering bulb illuminated the lot. I pulled up to one of the pumps and got out, the dry night air biting at my skin. There was an odd smell in the air, something acrid, like burnt rubber mixed with decay. I glanced around, but there were no other cars or signs of life. The pump didn't work when I tried it. A weathered sign taped to it read, "Pay inside." As I walked toward the building, I noticed something strange. The desert seemed unnaturally quiet. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just an oppressive silence that made my footsteps on the cracked asphalt sound deafening. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. Inside, the station was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans of food, faded magazines, and odd knickknacks that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he'd been sitting there for 100 years. His skin was leathery and wrinkled, and his eyes were sunken, almost lifeless. He barely moved when I walked in. "20 on pump 2, I said, placing a bill on the counter. The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes, his lips barely moving as he muttered, "Long way from anywhere, ain't ya?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just passing through." He took the money with a slow, deliberate motion and rang it up on an ancient register. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the wall behind the counter. A row of photographs, all Polaroids, each showing a car parked at the gas station. The eerie part, every car was empty. I stopped in my tracks. "What's with the pictures?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he just grinned, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too white for someone his age. I backed out of the store, my heart racing, and hurried to the pump. As I filled my tank, I glanced nervously toward the building. Through the window, the old man was watching me, his face expressionless. That's when I noticed something in the reflection of my car's side mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A figure standing in the shadows of the lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering bulb. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated in a way that didn't look human. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I yanked the nozzle out of the tank and jumped into my car, slamming the door and locking it. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into gear. As I sped out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure step into the light. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth, featureless, and pale as bone. I kept driving, my pulse hammering in my ears. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but every time I glanced in the mirror, I saw that thing. It wasn't running or chasing me. It was just there, standing in the middle of the road, closer every time I looked. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of a small diner ahead. I pulled into the parking lot, breathing a sigh of relief as I stumbled inside. The waitress behind the counter gave me a concerned look. "You okay, Hon?" I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. Just needed to get off the road for a bit. As I sat down, I noticed a bulletin board near the entrance covered in old newspaper clippings. One headline caught my eye. Mysterious disappearances near Riley's gas station. The article detailed how travelers had gone missing along the same stretch of road for decades. Their cars were always found abandoned near the station, but the people were never seen again. I looked up at the waitress, my mouth dry. "That station? Riley's. Is it still open?" She frowned. "Riley's? That place burned down years ago. Nobody's been out there since." My stomach dropped. "But I was just there," I whispered. The waitress stared at me, her face pale. "If you were," she said slowly, "you're lucky to be sitting here right now." I didn't ask any more questions. I just finished my coffee, got back in my car, and drove until the sun came up, vowing never to take that road again.
Story number 8.
I was driving cross-country to visit my sister in California, cutting through the empty plains of Kansas. The landscape was barren, endless fields of dry grass stretching in every direction. The radio was just static. My phone had no signal, and the only sound was the hum of my car engine. It was past midnight when my gas gauge dipped below a quarter tank. I started scanning for signs of civilization, but the road seemed to go on forever without so much as a streetlight. Then, out of nowhere, a small neon sign appeared on the horizon. Barker's Gas and Market. The station was the only structure for miles, sitting alone under a sky so dark it felt oppressive. Its neon sign flickered erratically, casting faint, sickly green light over the lot. The pumps were old and weathered, the kind you'd expect to find in a history book. I pulled in and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, carrying a faint smell of something sour and rotten. I tried to use the pump, but the digital display showed only garbled numbers. A rusty sign attached to the pump read, "See attendant inside." The windows of the gas station were dark, except for a faint light flickering at the back of the store. Reluctantly, I headed inside. The bell above the door let out a hollow, metallic clang as I entered. The interior was worse than I expected. Dust-covered shelves lined with expired canned goods, ancient newspapers stacked in a corner, and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its light weak and yellow. Behind the counter stood a man. His back was to me, and he didn't move when I came in. He was tall and gaunt, his shoulders hunched unnaturally. "Excuse me," I said, my voice echoing too loudly in the empty space. "I need to prepay for gas." Slowly, the man turned around, and I froze. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. His lips curled into a smile that revealed teeth too sharp and too perfect to be real. "How much?" he asked, his voice low and guttural, like it wasn't used to speaking. $20, I stammered, sliding the bill across the counter. His hand reached out long and bony, with nails that looked more like claws. He snatched the money and nodded. "Pump 3. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. As I filled the tank, I kept glancing back at the store. The man was standing at the window now, watching me. I tried to stay calm, but then I heard something. Soft at first, but growing louder. It was a high-pitched wailing, like a child crying, coming from somewhere near the edge of the lot. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the sound. In the distance, just beyond the glow of the station's light, I saw movement, A figure, small and hunched, was crawling toward me on all fours. Its limbs were long and twisted, bending in ways that didn't make sense. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't a child at all. Its face was a contorted mix of human and animal features, with hollow black eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. Panicking, I yanked the nozzle out of the tank and jumped into my car. As I started the engine, the creature let out a piercing scream and broke into a sprint, if moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I tore out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I could see the creature chasing me, its limbs flailing wildly as it ran. But then, as I sped down the road, the gas station's lights disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The creature stopped, standing motionless in the middle of the road, its hollow eyes watching me until I was too far away to see it. Eventually, I found another gas station, at this one bright and modern, with other cars in the lot. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I stepped out of the car. Inside, I told the clerk what I'd seen, but he just gave me a strange look. "Barker's?" he said. "That place hasn't existed in years. Burned down back in the 70s. They say the owner went crazy and killed a bunch of people before setting the place on fire. Some folks say you can still find it if you're unlucky enough." I didn't argue. I just filled my tank and kept driving, the clerk's words echoing in my head. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for sure. If you're ever driving through the Kansas plains and see a neon sign for Barker's Gas and Market, keep going. Whatever you find there isn't meant for this world.
Story number 9.
It was around 3 a.m., and I was driving through a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. My road trip was behind schedule, and I was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. The twisting roads were lined with thick forests, and the only light came from my high beams slicing through the dark. When the low fuel warning chimed, I cursed under my breath. My GPS wasn't picking up a signal, so I had no idea how far the next town was. Just when I thought I might be stranded, a dimly lit gas station appeared around a bend, Eagle's Roost Gas and Supplies. The place looked ancient, like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. A single flickering bulb hung over the pumps, and the small building was shrouded in shadow. Desperation won over caution, and I pulled into the lot. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No insects, no wind, just silence. The pump was old, the kind with a crank handle, and I quickly realized it wasn't functional. A small sign hung on it, "Pay inside." The door to the building creaked loudly as I opened it, and a bell jingled faintly above me. Inside, the air was stale and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The shelves were lined with strange items, rusted tools, jars of an unidentifiable black liquid, and faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. Behind the counter stood an older woman with wiry gray hair. Her eyes were sharp and unsettling, and her face bore an expression that was hard to read. "Just need some gas," I said, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer right away, just stared at me for a moment before nodding. "Cash only," she said, her voice low and gravelly. I handed her a 20 and asked, "How far is the next town?" Her lips twitched into a small, humorless smile. "Farther than you'll get on a full tank," she said cryptically. I was about to ask what she meant, but a loud thud interrupted me. It came from the back of the store, behind a curtain that separated the counter from some unseen room. The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes darted to the curtain and back to me. "Pump's ready," she said, her tone flat. I stepped outside, eager to leave. As I filled the tank, I heard a strange sound coming from the woods. A low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing. Still, the growling grew louder, closer. Suddenly, something darted out of the trees, a shadowy figure, hunched and fast, its limbs too long and its movements too jerky to be human. It stopped just at the edge of the light, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me. I froze, the nozzle still in my hand. The creature let out a sound somewhere between a snarl and a hiss, and I stumbled backward, dropping the nozzle. The gas station door creaked open, and the old woman stepped out, carrying a lantern. She didn't look at me, only at the creature. "Not tonight," she said firmly, her voice echoing in the silence. The creature hissed again, but slowly retreated into the woods, its glowing eyes the last thing to disappear into the darkness. Shaking, I finished filling my tank and jumped into my car. The old woman stood in the doorway, watching as I started the engine. "Stay on the road," she called out as I pulled away. "And don't stop for anyone." I didn't ask questions, I just drove, my heart pounding. For the next hour, I followed her advice, keeping my eyes on the road. But as I neared the highway, I saw something ahead, red and blue lights flashing in the distance. A police car was parked across the road, its lights spinning wildly. I slowed down, but something felt wrong. The car was empty and the driver's side door was wide open. As I inched closer, I saw a smear of blood across the hood. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. In the rearview mirror, something was coming up behind me fast, something with glowing yellow eyes. I slammed on the gas, swerving around the abandoned police car, and didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop miles down the road. When I told the attendant about what I'd seen, he gave me a strange look. "Eagle's Roost?" he asked. I nodded. "That place burned down 20 years ago. Some kind of accident. They say it was haunted before the fire and cursed after. You're lucky you made it out." I didn't reply. I just filled up my tank again, stayed under the lights as long as I could, and drove until the sun came up.
Story number 10.
I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. At least, I wasn't. But after what happened to me last year at a lonely gas station in the middle of nowhere, I can't shake the feeling that there are things in this world we're not supposed to understand. It was late, somewhere around midnight, when I was driving back home from a business trip. I'd been on the road for hours, and my GPS told me there was still another 3 hours to go. I was tired, but the thought of pulling over and sleeping in my car didn't sit right with me. I wanted to get home. I noticed my gas gauge dipping dangerously low, so when I saw a flickering neon sign for a gas station just ahead, I decided to pull over. It was one of those small old-school stations, the kind with a single pump and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. As I stepped out of the car, the air felt different. Heavy, almost, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I told myself I was being dramatic and started pumping gas. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint whisper. I froze. It was soft, almost indistinct, but it was definitely a voice. "Help me," it said. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. Just the wind brushing through the trees and the dull hum of the gas pump. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me." It sounded like a woman, her voice trembling with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just silence. I glanced around the station. The convenience store's lights were on, but I couldn't see anyone inside. I figured the clerk must be in the back, so I decided to go in and ask if they'd heard anything. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. The place smelled faintly of mildew and motor oil, and the shelves were half empty, stocked with outdated snacks and dusty cans of soda. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed unnervingly. No answer. I walked up to the counter, noticing an old cash register and a dusty jar labeled "Tips." There was a faded Polaroid taped to the counter, a picture of a smiling woman in her late 20s. Written on it in marker were the words, "In loving memory of Sarah." Something about that photo made my skin crawl, but I couldn't explain why. "Hey, anyone back there?" I shouted toward the door that led to what I assumed was a storage room. Still no response. Then I heard it again. "Help me." This time it sounded like it was coming from the storage room. My stomach knotted. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but something, maybe morbid curiosity, drew me toward the door. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly. The room was dimly lit, with boxes piled haphazardly everywhere. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But then, in the corner, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a mirror leaning against the wall, its surface foggy and tarnished. In its reflection, I could see the room. But not just the room. There was a figure standing behind me. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her mouth moved silently, but when I spun around, there was no one there. I stared at the mirror, my heart pounding. She was still there, her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. And then as I watched, her mouth formed the words, "Don't leave me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But the terror in her eyes felt so real, so visceral. I bolted out of the storage room and back to the car. The gas pump had clicked off, but I didn't care about getting a receipt. I just wanted to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced at the convenience store one last time. The woman was there, standing in the doorway, watching me. Only now her face wasn't sad. It was twisted into a chilling smile. I peeled out of there, my tires screeching on the asphalt. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles down the road. I didn't talk about what happened for weeks. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then, a month later, I came across a news article while scrolling through my phone. It was about a missing woman named Sarah who'd worked at a gas station, the same gas station I'd stopped at. She'd vanished without a trace 5 years ago, and her case had gone cold. My stomach dropped as I read the article. The picture they used was the same one I'd seen taped to the counter. I don't know what happened to Sarah or why she appeared to me that night, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, trapped in that place, waiting for someone to help her. Now, every time I pass a lonely gas station on the highway, I feel a cold shiver run down my spine. I'll never stop at one again, because sometimes the darkness you sense isn't just in your head, it's real, and it's watching.